Commander Jinwoo pressed his palms against the cold metal console. Watching numbers cascade across the holographic display, the translation programs had been running for 6 hours straight, but the message they decoded made his blood freeze. Earth had received its first communication from the stars, and it carried the weight of an executioner's blade. The alien transmission crackled through speakers and defense centers across the globe. 12 massive ships hung in space beyond the moon, each one larger than Earth's biggest cities. They belonged to something called the Hegemony Council, and their leader spoke with the casual indifference of someone ordering lunch. Primitive world designation Terra 3. The voice echoed through the Seoul facility, translated into perfect Korean by machines that still struggled to believe what they were processing. You have 7 solar cycles to surrender unconditionally. Submit and become client subjects of the hegemony. Remain silent and face conquest. No negotiation, no exceptions. Jinwoo's hands trembled as he reached for the secure communication line. Around him, junior officers stared at their screens in stunned silence. The aliens had demonstrated their power just hours before gravity fields that lifted entire city blocks into the air, held them suspended for exactly 60 seconds, then gently set them down. No damage, no casualties. It's just a quiet reminder of what they could do if they chose to be less gentle. In Tokyo, General Minho paced the emergency command center while video feeds showed crowds gathering in the streets. Some people prayed, others rioted, and many simply stood motionless, staring at the sky. The general's secure phone buzzed constantly with calls from world leaders, each one asking the same impossible question: what do we do now? The demonstration was surgical, Minho told the assembled ministers, his voice steady, despite the chaos surrounding them. They lifted the Tokyo Metropolitan Building, the Empire State Building, the Burj Khalifa, and 6 other landmarks simultaneously. Different continents, different time zones, but perfect coordination. They want us to know that distance means nothing to them. Dr. Su-young hunched over her workstation in Berlin, analyzing every frame of the alien transmission. As Earth's leading expert in theoretical xenobiology, she had spent her career imagining what first contact might look like. She had written papers about peaceful scientific exchange, about cultural bridges between species, about the dawn of a new age for humanity. None of her theories had prepared her for this. They speak to us like we're insects, she muttered to her research assistant, replaying the message for the 100th time. Look at their posture, their tone. This isn't a negotiation or even a threat. It's a procedure. They've done this before. Her computer chimed with an incoming data packet from the Deep Space Monitoring Network. Radio telescopes around the world had been tracking the alien ships since they appeared, and the information painted a terrifying picture. The vessels showed signs of extreme age, their hulls bearing the scars of countless battles. These were not explorers or diplomats. They were conquerors with millennia of experience. The 7-day countdown began at exactly midnight Greenwich Mean Time. Digital displays in every major city showed the hours ticking away 168 hours until humanity's deadline. News anchors struggled to maintain composure as they reported on humanity's first and possibly last contact with alien intelligence. Religious leaders called for prayer while scientists desperately searched for solutions that did not exist. But in military installations across the globe, something unexpected was happening. Officers who should have been planning evacuations were instead pulling dusty files from storage. Weapons designers who should have been fleeing to bunkers were calculating payload capacities. Engineers who should have been hiding with their families were converting civilian spacecraft into improvised warships. Commander, Jinwoo received the first reports just 18 hours into the countdown. Every space-capable nation was mobilizing their assets, not for evacuation, not for hiding, but for war. The Americans were arming their space shuttles with nuclear warheads. The Russians were mounting railguns on cargo vessels. The Chinese were converting their space station into a weapons platform. "Sir," his aide reported, voice cracking with disbelief, "they're all doing the same thing. Everyone's preparing to fight." Dr. Su-yang watched the mobilization reports with fascination and horror. Her xenobiology models suggested that any species capable of interstellar travel would be thousands of years ahead of human technology. Fighting them would be like Stone Age hunters attacking modern tanks. Yet humanity was choosing suicide over surrender. She pulled up historical records, searching for precedents. Every conquered civilization in human history had eventually submitted when faced with impossible odds. Romans had surrendered to barbarians, empires had yielded to new technologies. Nations had capitulated rather than face total destruction. But this felt different. This felt like the moment when a cornered animal realizes it has nothing left to lose. General Minho stood before a wall of monitors showing military preparations worldwide, crude weapons, desperate plans, and impossible odds. Any rational species would be broadcasting surrender terms by now. Instead, humanity was loading guns and picking targets. The aliens had given Earth 7 days to choose between submission and conquest. They had never imagined a third option: defiance. For the first time in galactic history, primitive world was preparing to answer an ultimatum not with words, but with weapons. The silence they demanded would be broken by the thunder of war. Admiral Koresh stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the countdown reach its final hours. In 3,000 years of conquest, he had witnessed this moment countless times. First came the panic, then desperate attempts at communication, and finally the blessed silence of acceptance. Species after species had followed the same pattern, understanding that resistance meant only death and destruction. His tactical officers monitored Earth's communications, waiting for the surrender broadcast that always came. The primitive world had shown remarkable restraint so far. No begging messages, no offers of tribute, no religious ceremonies broadcast into space. Perhaps they would be one of the rare species wise enough to submit without forcing a demonstration of hegemony power. Admiral Subcommander Thren called from his station, his voice uncertain. "I'm detecting unusual movement from the planet's surface." Koresh moved to the tactical display, expecting to see evacuation ships fleeing to the outer planets. Instead, his eyes widened as he watched something impossible unfold. Earth was launching everything with engines. Military vessels, cargo haulers, research craft. Even civilian transports were rising from the planet's surface and taking defensive positions. Captain Minji gripped the controls of her converted freight hauler, feeling the unfamiliar weight of missile pods welded to her ship's hull. 3 days ago, she had been hauling medical supplies between Earth and Mars. Now her cargo hold was packed with explosives, and her passenger seats had been replaced with targeting computers operated by volunteers who had never seen combat. "Is insane," her gunner muttered, checking the improvised weapon systems for the 10th time. "We're flying a truck against warships." Mingi smiled grimly. "Then we better make sure it's the loudest truck they've ever heard." Around her, the combined fleet of humanity took shape in the darkness of space. American nuclear submarines converted for spaceflight floated alongside. Russian mining barges fitted with railguns. Japanese research vessels bristled with improvised weapons, while European cargo ships carried payloads of industrial explosives. Even the tourist shuttles that normally ferried wealthy passengers too. Orbital hotels had been stripped down and armed with whatever weapons could be mounted on their frames. Colonel Dong-ho coordinated the desperate fleet from Luna Base. Screens showing nearly 200 vessels of every size and description. Professional warships designed for space combat numbered less than 20. The rest were civilian craft crewed by volunteers who knew they were flying to their deaths. "Phoenix Squadron, this is Luna Control," he transmitted to a group of converted passenger liners. "Your target is the third ship from the left. Get as close as you can before they notice you're armed." On the Hegemony flagship, chaos erupted in the command center. Tactical officers who had spent centuries cataloging easy victories now stared at displays showing something they had never seen before. A primitive species was actually fighting back. "Admiral, this doesn't match any of our conquest protocols," Subcommander Thren reported, his voice rising with panic. "They're not surrendering. They're not fleeing. They're attacking us, Admiral." Koresh studied the human fleet through his ship's sensors. The vessels were laughably primitive, their weapons crude modifications of industrial equipment. A single hegemony destroyer could eliminate the entire human force without taking damage. But that wasn't the point. In 3 millennia of conquest, no species had ever chosen to fight rather than submit. "Sir, what are our orders?" Thren asked. "Do we proceed with standard conquest protocols?" Koresh hesitated. The protocols had been written for dealing with submissive populations, not armed resistance. His species had grown so accustomed to easy victories that they had forgotten how to fight actual battles. Captain Minji's ship shuddered as she pushed the engines beyond safe limits. Her improvised fleet was moving into attack formation, a ragged line of desperate vessels facing an enemy that could destroy them with a thought. But they kept flying anyway. "All ships, this is Phoenix Leader," she broadcast on all frequencies. "We know what we're facing. We know what this costs. But today, humanity speaks with one voice." The human fleet spread out across the space between Earth and the hegemony ships. Cargo haulers took point positions, while passenger liners moved to flank the alien formation. Research vessels loaded with experimental weapon systems prepared to test technologies that had never been used in combat. Every ship carried the same message painted on their hulls in dozens of languages Earth remembers. Colonel Dongho watched the deployment from his command post, knowing that most of these brave souls would not return home. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The hegemony possessed weapons that could vaporize planets. Humanity had mining, explosives, and determination. "All ships, final check," he transmitted. "Remember, we're not trying to win this battle. We're trying to make sure they never forget it." Admiral Koresh received reports from his ship commanders, all expressing the same confusion. How should they respond to armed resistance? Their weapons were designed to destroy planets, not engage in ship-to-ship combat with tiny vessels. Tactics assumed submission, not defiance. For the first time in galactic history, the silence that marked the end of conquest was broken. Earth had chosen to answer the hegemony's ultimatum, not with words, but with weapons. The thunder of human defiance echoed across the void, announcing that some species would rather die fighting than live kneeling. The age of easy conquest was about to end. The first shots of the battle rang out at exactly 0800 Earth Standard Time. But Admiral Koresh quickly realized that what he was witnessing could hardly be called a battle at all. It was something far more terrifying. The death throes of a species that refused to die quietly. Captain Minji's converted cargo. Hauler screamed through space toward the nearest hegemony cruiser, her engines pushed so far beyond safe limits that the hull groaned with each second. Her crew of volunteers, a mechanic, 2 teachers, and a retired pilot worked frantically to keep the improvised weapon systems online as alien defensive fire lit up the darkness around them. "Phoenix Leader to all ships," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her fleet. "Remember what we're fighting for? Not just our lives, but our right to dream." The hegemony cruiser's defensive systems tracked her approach with mechanical precision. Their computers calculated her trajectory, analyzed her primitive weapons, and determined that her vessel posed no significant threat. The alien ship's shields could absorb the impact of a small asteroid. Register, the computers were wrong. Minji had spent the past 3 days working with Earth's best engineers to turn her ship into something unprecedented. A guided nuclear bomb with delusions of being a spacecraft. Her cargo hold contained not trade goods, but the reactor from a decommissioned power plant, rigged to detonate on impact. Her final transmission echoed across the battle space as she dove toward the alien ship. For every child who dreams of stars, the explosion tore through space like a miniature sun. The hegemony cruiser's shields, designed to deflect energy weapons and debris, had no defense against a suicidal pilot willing to turn her entire ship into a weapon. The blast punched through their defensive barriers and crippled the vessel's weapon arrays, sending debris spinning into the void. On the hegemony flagship, Subcommander Thren stared at his tactical display in shock. "Admiral, the humans they just destroyed themselves to damage one of our ships." Their tactical computers show the pilot had multiple escape opportunities, but she chose to die instead. Admiral Koresh felt something cold settle in his stomach. In 3,000 years of conquest, he had seen species fight desperately for survival, but never had he encountered warriors who chose death over retreat. The humans were rewriting the rules of engagement with every passing moment. Lieutenant Hayok led his squadron of converted mining vessels against a formation of hegemony fighters, their hulls bristling with industrial cutting lasers never designed for combat. Ships were slow, clumsy, and completely outmatched by the sleek alien craft. But they had one advantage their enemies couldn't understand. They had nothing left to lose. "Mining squadron to all vessels," he broadcast, watching enemy fighters swarm toward his formation. "They think we're primitive? Let's show them how animals fight." His ships scattered in all directions, abandoning any pretense of formation flying. The hegemony fighters, programmed for combat against civilized opponents, struggled to adapt to the chaotic tactics. Mining vessels used their drilling equipment to punch through fighter hulls at point-blank range. Cargo haulers rammed enemy ships while their crews manually detonated mining charges. Tourist shuttles packed with volunteers flew kamikaze runs against targets 10 times their size. Dr. Suyang watched the battle unfold from her underground laboratory, her screens showing a tactical situation that defied every military textbook ever written. Human vessels were dying by the dozens, but they were taking alien ships with them. Each loss inflicted a price that the hegemony had never been forced to pay. "They can't adapt," she whispered to her assistant, watching a hegemony destroyer struggle to target human ships that refused to follow predictable flight patterns. "They've spent so long conquering submissive species that they've forgotten how to fight actual wars." The alien fleet possessed overwhelming technological superiority, but their tactics assumed rational opponents who valued survival. Humans were proving to be anything but rational. They flew damaged ships until they exploded, used civilian vessels as guided missiles, and turned every piece of equipment into a weapon. Admiral Koresh received casualty reports with growing disbelief. 3 capital ships damaged or destroyed, dozens of fighters lost, and hundreds of crew members dead or injured. The human fleet was being annihilated, but they were making the hegemony pay for every victory with blood and metal. "Admiral Subcommander," Thren reported, his voice trembling, "they're not trying to survive this battle. They're trying to make us pay for winning it." The tactical display showed the truth of those words. Human ships that could have retreated to fight another day instead chose to ram alien vessels. Pilots with damaged craft flew suicide runs rather than surrender. Even civilian vessels loaded with non-combatants turned themselves into weapons. When cornered, Lieutenant Hayok's mining ship, its hull cracked and atmosphere venting, made one final run at a hegemony cruiser. His last transmission was barely audible through the static. "Tell Earth we made them bleed." The explosion lit up the battle space, and another alien ship went dark. Admiral Koresh stared at the spreading debris field, realizing that his forces faced something beyond their experience, a species that had chosen to die fighting rather than live in chains. For the first time in 3 millennia, a hegemony was learning the true cost of conquest. Dr. Suyang's eyes opened slowly, her vision blurred and her skull pounding like a drum. The last thing she remembered was the blinding light of a hegemony. Capture beam striking her evacuation shuttle as she fled Earth's orbital laboratories. Now she found herself in a sterile white cell aboard an alien vessel, the gentle hum of artificial gravity beneath her feet. Across from her sat a creature she had only seen in theoretical studies, tall, graceful, with silver skin that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light. Its large eyes held an intelligence that seemed both ancient and deeply sad. When it spoke, the words came slowly, as if each one required great effort to remember. "I am Zeph," the being said in broken but understandable English. "I remember your language from the archives. We learned many languages when we still believed in." Suyang sat up carefully, her scientific mind cataloging details even through her confusion. The creature was Kithra, one of the hegemony's oldest client species. According to her research, they had been conquered over 2,000 years ago and had served the Empire faithfully ever since. "You speak English?" she said, surprised. How is that possible? Zeph's expression grew even sadder. The hegemony requires us to study the languages of worlds they plan to conquer. It's help with ... integration afterward. Your language was added to our learning protocols 50 years ago, when they first detected your radio signals. The words sent a chill down Su-Yang's spine. The aliens had been planning Earth's conquest for half a century, studying human culture and language, while humanity remained oblivious to their existence. But something in Zeph's manner suggested there was more to the story. Over the following hours, as guards brought them water and strange-tasting food, Zeph began to share the truth about life under hegemony rule. The aliens didn't simply conquer worlds, they systematically destroyed everything that made a species unique, replacing cultural identity with grateful servitude. My people once had warrior songs, Zeph whispered, glancing nervously at the door where alien guards stood watch. We sang them before battle, during the hunt, when children were born. Songs that told of our ancestors' courage, of the time when we roamed free among the stars. Su-Yang leaned closer, fascinated despite their dire circumstances. What happened to the songs? The hegemony taught us that such things were primitive. Wasteful, they said. Civilized beings should focus on useful activities, not meaningless noise. Zeph's voice grew softer. Now we barely remember the melodies. Only the oldest among us can recall fragments, and they dare not sing them aloud. As their conversation continued, Su-Yang began to understand the true horror of hegemony conquest. It wasn't enough to defeat a species militarily. They had to be broken spiritually, convinced that their submission was wisdom rather than defeat. Every client race had been taught to see their conquerors as benefactors who had saved them from their own primitive impulses. But something unprecedented was happening across hegemony space. Through the cell's small viewport, Su-Yang could see other ships in the alien fleet, and Zeph explained that many contained representatives from client species who served as translators, administrators, and technical specialists. These beings had access to communication networks that spanned the galaxy. They are watching, Zeph said quietly. The battle at your world was broadcast throughout hegemony space. Every client species saw your people choose death over submission. Implications struck Su-Yang like a physical blow. Humanity's desperate last stand wasn't just about Earth's freedom. It was being witnessed by countless species who had forgotten what resistance looked like. On distant worlds, changes were already beginning. On Quinn Prime, elderly warriors who had spent decades in quiet servitude began gathering in secret meetings, sharing half-remembered stories of the battles their ancestors had fought before the Great Silence. Yongquen, who had never heard such tales, listened with growing amazement as they learned their people had once been fighters rather than servants. The Miralith colonies, spread across 17 star systems, experienced their own awakening. Resistance cells formed overnight as beings who had accepted their fate for generations suddenly remembered that submission was a choice, it's not an inevitability. They began sharing encrypted messages, planning actions that would have been unthinkable just days before. Even species that had served the hegemony for over a millennium felt the stirrings of forgotten pride. The sight of human ships choosing kamikaze runs over surrender had reminded them that there were alternatives to kneeling. Your people did something impossible, Zeph told Su-Yang, as they watched alien crew members hurrying through the corridors. Outside their cell, for 3,000 years, every species faced with hegemony conquest has made the same choice: submit or die. Your humans found a third option. Su-Yang frowned. What third option? We're being conquered just like everyone else. Zeph's eyes brightened for the first time since their conversation began. You chose to die fighting. That sounds simple, but it changes everything. Every client species watching your battle learned that resistance is possible, that death with dignity is better than life in chains. Through the viewport, emergency lights began flashing on ships throughout the hegemony fleet. Reports were flooding in from across their empire uprisings, sabotage, open rebellion on worlds that had been peaceful for centuries. Your people, Zeph whispered, his voice filled with something that might have been hope. They reminded the galaxy how to scream. The age of silent submission was ending. Earth's thunder had become the battle cry of a galaxy. ready to fight for its freedom. The rebellion began with a single transmission that traveled faster than light across the galaxy. Zeph the Kithra, prisoner who had befriended Dr. Su Yang, managed to access the Hegemony flagship's communication system during a shift change. His message was brief but carried the power to shatter 3,000 years of enforced peace. The humans fight, and we can fight too. Those 7 words reached Kithra Prime within hours, transmitted through the same networks the Hegemony used to control their empire. Elder Kithira, who had spent decades in quiet servitude, heard the message and felt something stir in their hearts that they had thought dead forever. They remembered the warrior songs their grandparents had whispered in secret, stories of battles fought before the Great Silence. By dawn on Kithra Prime, the first uprising had begun. Workers in the industrial districts abandoned their posts and seized weapons from security stations. The Hegemony garrison, accustomed to dealing with a docile population, found themselves facing enemies who fought with the fury of the long oppressed. The rebellion spread like wildfire across 12 star systems. On Quen Prime, aged warriors who had been forced to serve as administrative clerks threw off their civilian clothes and donned armor their ancestors had worn. They led devastating raids against Hegemony supply lines using tactics that had been forbidden for generations, but never truly forgotten. The Moralith colonies experienced their own awakening. These beings had once been master guerrilla fighters, turning their jungle worlds into nightmares for invading armies. Under Hegemony rule, they had become peaceful farmers and technicians. But as news of Earth's defiance spread, they remembered their old ways. Within days, Moralith cities became death traps for occupying forces. With every building a potential ambush point and every citizen a potential fighter, Admiral Koresh stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching reports of chaos flood in from across his empire. The tactical display that had once shown the orderly administration of conquered worlds now blazed with red warning symbols indicating uprisings, sabotage, and open warfare. "This is impossible," he muttered to Subcommander Thren, his voice filled with disbelief. "One primitive world cannot undo 3 millennia of order." But even as he spoke, Koresh knew his words were false. It wasn't one world anymore. The human example had awakened something in every client species that the Hegemony had thought safely buried beneath layers of conditioning and cultural suppression. Commander Ji-hoon, who had taken command of Earth's surviving forces after Captain Minji's heroic sacrifice, coordinated the planet's desperate defense from a converted asteroid mining station. His fleet consisted of barely 50 operational vessels, most of them damaged and running on borrowed time. But they continued to fight, launching hit-and-run attacks that kept the Hegemony forces occupied while rebellion spread across the galaxy. "All Earth ships, this is command," Ji-hoon transmitted during one of their brief respites between battles. "Intelligence reports that 17 different species have risen in rebellion. We're not alone anymore." Dr. Su Yang, working from her improvised laboratory aboard the captured Hegemony vessel, had joined forces with Zeph to coordinate the growing resistance. Together, they broadcast tactical information and inspirational messages across the communication networks that the Hegemony had once used to maintain control. "The key is coordination," Su Yang explained to Zeph as they worked to establish secure channels between rebel groups. "Each species is fighting alone, but if we can link them together, share information and resources, they become something greater than the sum of their parts." The breakthrough came when the first liberated Quen warships arrived in Earth's solar system. These vessels had been thought destroyed centuries ago, hidden in asteroid fields and forgotten shipyards by Quen who refused to accept defeat. Now, they emerged from hiding, their ancient weapons recharged and their crews eager for battle. The Moralith followed, bringing with them fast attack craft that could strike and disappear before the enemy could respond. The Cathora contributed their knowledge of Hegemony technology, having spent centuries maintaining the very systems. They now turned against their former masters. Other species joined the alliance as word spread. The crystalline Vorth brought weapons that could shatter Hegemony shields. The aquatic Delph contributed their expertise in underwater and zero-gravity combat. Even species that had been conquered so long ago that their names were barely remembered in galactic archives emerged from hiding to join the fight. The final battle came not over Earth, but simultaneously throughout the galaxy. The Gemini forces found themselves fighting on 1,000 fronts as their empire crumbled from within. Admiral Koresh, his fleet reduced to a fraction of its original strength, made a desperate last stand in Earth's solar system. Commander Ji-hoon stood on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by representatives from dozens of liberated worlds. The combined fleet facing the hegemony remnants represented the dreams of countless species who had thought freedom was lost forever. All ships, this is overall command. Ji-hoon broadcast on all frequencies as the final battle began. Earth taught the galaxy to speak again. Today we teach it to sing. The battle that followed was not the one-sided slaughter the hegemony had expected. Instead, it became a symphony of liberation, with each species contributing their unique strengths to a common cause. The age of enforced silence died in thunder and starfire, and the galaxy finally remembered its voice.